My son slid a plastic container of cold leftovers across the dinner table without even looking at me. "Eat quietly tonight," Mom Ethan said. "Nobody wants another emotional story." The room went silent. My daughter-in-law smirked into her wine glass. My granddaughter stared at her plate like she wanted to disappear. And me, I sat there holding a fork, with shaking hands, realizing I had become an unwanted guest in the family I built with my own sacrifices. That night, while rain hammered against my windshield, I drove straight to my lawyer's office. By sunrise, my son was no longer the main heir in my will. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, I want you to tell me in the comments. What would you have done in my place? And wherever you're watching from tonight, leave your city and local time below. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone. Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to your heart. People love talking about motherhood, like it's some glowing Hallmark movie filled with warm kitchens and grateful children. Nobody tells you what it feels like when the child you built your entire life around slowly begins looking at you like an inconvenience. I used to believe Ethan Moore was the greatest thing I had ever done with my life. When he was born, I was 26 years old and terrified. My husband, Walter, had held my hand in the hospital and whispered, "We'll figure it out together, Aria." And for many years we did. Walter worked long shifts as a firefighter in Cleveland, while I worked as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital. We weren't rich, far from it. Some winters, we had to choose between fixing the heater or paying down credit card debt. There were nights Walter came home smelling like smoke and exhaustion, while I came home with aching feet and dried sanitizer on my hands. But Ethan never knew how hard it really was. We protected him from that. I still remember sewing patches onto his little baseball uniform at 2 a.m, because we couldn't afford a new one. I remember skipping lunch during my shifts so we could save enough money for his school field trips. When Walter's back injury forced him into early retirement, I picked up double shifts without complaining. Because that's what mothers do. Or at least, that's what I believed. After Walter died from pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, Ethan became my entire world. Losing my husband felt like someone had scooped out the center of my chest with bare hands. For months, I couldn't sleep in our bedroom without breaking down. Ethan had been kind back then. He called every day. He brought groceries. He hugged me when I cried. Dad would want us to take care of each other, he told me at the funeral. I believed him. That was before Vanessa. Now, don't misunderstand me. I didn't hate my daughter-in-law when Ethan first introduced her to us. Vanessa was polished and charming in public. She worked in real estate, dressed beautifully, and always knew exactly what to say around strangers. But there was something cold behind her smile. Walter noticed it before I did. One night after Ethan brought her over for dinner, Walter quietly said to me while washing dishes, "That woman calculates every room she walks into." I laughed at him then. I wish I hadn't. After they married, Ethan slowly changed in ways that were hard to explain at first. He stopped calling as often. Then he stopped visiting unless he needed something. Then conversations became transactional. "Can you help with the down payment? Can you co-sign this loan? Could you babysit Grace this weekend?" I always said yes. Always. Because mothers are trained to believe love means endless giving. Even after Walter died, I helped Ethan financially more times than I should have. When his contracting business struggled during the pandemic, I emptied a savings account Walter and I had spent 20 years building. "It's temporary," Ethan promised. But temporary somehow became permanent. 3 years later, I suffered a mild heart attack while grocery shopping alone. That was when Ethan insisted I move in with them. "At least until you recover," he said. Vanessa smiled tightly beside him. "We have the extra room." At first, I thought maybe God was giving me my family back. I imagined movie nights with my granddaughter Grace, Sunday breakfasts, warm conversations, a second chance at closeness. Instead, I slowly became a burden living under their roof. The extra room turned out to be a converted storage room beside the laundry area in the basement. Vanessa apologized with fake sweetness. "It's just temporary until we reorganize upstairs." That reorganization never happened. At first, I tried to stay useful. I folded laundry, cooked dinner twice a week, picked Grace up from school when Vanessa was busy. But somehow, no matter how much I helped, I always felt like I was in the way. Vanessa corrected everything I did. "You're loading the dishwasher wrong. You used too much butter. Grace has too much homework to sit around listening to old stories." Little cuts, tiny humiliations, the kind that don't sound abusive when repeated aloud, but slowly hollow you out from the inside. And Ethan. He rarely defended me anymore. Sometimes he just stayed quiet. Other times he acted annoyed that I even looked hurt. One evening, I overheard Vanessa talking in the kitchen while she thought I was asleep downstairs. "I just didn't think it would be this much," she whispered. Ethan sighed heavily. "She's old, Vanessa." "She's not that old," Vanessa snapped back. "And your mother acts like this house belongs to her?" I sat on the edge of my basement bed, listening to those words over and over. This house belongs to her. The cruel irony. The down payment for their beautiful suburban home had come from Walter's life insurance money. Money we had saved for our own retirement. But I said nothing, because by then, silence had become survival. The only person who still treated me like family was Grace. My granddaughter was 17 then. Quiet, observant, different from her parents in ways that gave me hope. Sometimes she'd sit downstairs with me after school while pretending to do homework. "You okay, Grandma?" she'd ask softly. And something about the way she said it made me want to cry every time. One afternoon, Grace found me staring at an old photo album. It was a picture of Walter teaching Ethan how to ride a bike. "You miss him a lot, don't you?" she asked. "Every day." Grace traced the edge of the photograph gently. "I think Grandpa would have hated how everyone acts now." The room went still. I looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. Then she forced a small shrug. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. Something in this family had begun rotting long before that dinner table humiliation. I just hadn't realized how deep it went yet. And the worst part, I still loved my son enough to keep making excuses for him, even while he slowly stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a problem waiting to disappear. The night everything finally broke started with lasagna. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? After all the sacrifices, all the grief, all the years of motherhood, it came down to a pan of overcooked lasagna sitting in the middle of a dining room table. It was a Thursday evening in October. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the smell of garlic bread filled the house upstairs. Vanessa had invited 2 of her friends over for dinner, both women from her real estate office, who wore expensive perfume and spoke loudly about vacations in Napa Valley. I almost didn't come upstairs. I had learned over the past year that my presence sometimes changed the atmosphere in ways nobody bothered hiding anymore. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became strained. Vanessa especially hated when I stayed too long at the table. Still, Grace came downstairs around 6:30 and knocked gently on my door. "Dinner's ready, Grandma." She smiled softly. That girl always smiled with sadness in her eyes lately. I followed her upstairs, slowly, careful with my breathing, because my chest still hurt sometimes after the heart attack. The dining room glowed warmly beneath the chandelier Walter once helped Ethan install years ago, back when this still felt like family. Vanessa barely looked at me. "Can you sit at the end?" she asked quickly. We need space over here. I nodded and sat quietly. The conversation moved around me almost immediately. Vacation homes, interest rates, kitchen remodels. One of Vanessa's friends laughed loudly while Ethan poured wine into crystal glasses we both knew I wasn't supposed to touch because of my medication. Nobody offered me water. Grace noticed and quietly got up to pour me a glass herself. "Thanks, sweetheart," I whispered. Vanessa gave her daughter a sharp look. "She's not helpless, Grace." The words weren't cruel enough to sound shocking. That was Vanessa's talent. She knew how to wound people in ways that sounded reasonable to outsiders. Dinner continued. I mostly stayed quiet, picking at my food while the others talked over me. Then one of Vanessa's friends pointed toward a framed photograph sitting on the fireplace mantel. It was a picture of Walter holding Ethan on his shoulders at Cedar Point when Ethan was maybe 7 years old. "Oh, that's adorable," the woman said. "Your husband." My chest tightened instantly. Even after 8 years, hearing Walter mentioned still felt like someone pressing on a bruise deep inside me. "Yes," I said softly. Walter loved roller coasters, even though he was terrified of heights. Nobody laughed, but I smiled anyway, because suddenly I could see Walter so clearly in my mind. The way he used to squeeze Ethan's sneakers to make sure they were tied tight before rides. The way Ethan used to beg for cotton candy. And for one stupid moment, I forgot I wasn't really welcome at that table anymore. Ethan was so scared on that ride, I continued gently. He cried halfway through, and Walter carried him the rest of the day because he thought his little legs were too shaky, Mom. Ethan's voice cut through mine instantly. Not loud, not angry, just irritated. I stopped talking. Vanessa took a sip of wine while staring down at her plate. One of her friends awkwardly smiled. I should have let it go. I know that now, but loneliness makes people desperate sometimes. When Walter got sick, I continued carefully. That was actually one of the memories he talked about near the end. Ethan dropped his fork against the plate hard enough to make everyone jump. Oh my God. The room went still. "Can we just eat dinner without turning everything into one of your sad stories?" My face burned immediately. We know Dad's dead." Ethan snapped. "Okay, we know." Silence swallowed the room. I looked at my son, and for one terrible second, I couldn't recognize the man sitting across from me. His jaw looked tight with annoyance. Not grief, not sadness, annoyance. Vanessa leaned back slowly, like she was exhausted by me. "Aria," she said in that fake calm voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. "Sometimes people just want one peaceful dinner. People, not family. People." I felt my throat closing. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," I whispered. Grace stared at her plate so hard I thought she might cry. Then Ethan did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. He grabbed the plastic container sitting near the stove leftovers from 2 nights earlier and slid it across the table toward me. The container stopped directly beside my shaking hands. "Just eat this quietly tonight, Mom," he muttered. "Nobody wants another emotional speech." I heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I heard rain outside. I heard my own heartbeat pounding so hard I thought I might faint. But nobody said a word. Not Vanessa. Not her friends. Nobody. One of the women looked uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to stop eating. That's the thing about humiliation. Most people witness it silently because they're relieved it isn't happening to them. My hands trembled as I slowly opened the plastic lid. Cold lasagna, half-eaten. Cheese hardened at the corners. I remember staring at it and thinking, this is who I am to them now. Not a mother, not a widow, not a human being with dignity. Just someone old enough to be fed scraps quietly in the corner. And God help me. I actually picked up the fork. Because humiliation changes you slowly. It trains you to accept smaller and smaller pieces of yourself disappearing. I took one bite. Cold. Rubbery. The sauce tasted sour. Nobody looked at me. The conversation resumed awkwardly around the table while I sat there swallowing shame with every bite. Except Grace. She looked horrified. At one point, our eyes met. Her lower lip trembled slightly. I realized then that she wasn't embarrassed of me. She was embarrassed of them. 10 minutes later, I quietly excused myself and carried the empty plastic container to the sink. Vanessa didn't thank me. Ethan didn't stop me. I walked downstairs carefully because my knees suddenly felt weak. Once inside my basement room, I closed the door softly behind me. And then I broke. Not loud, not dramatic. I simply sat on the edge of the bed staring at Walter's old photograph while tears rolled silently down my face. I kept hearing Ethan's voice over and over. Eat quietly tonight. As if my existence itself had become something irritating. After nearly an hour, I heard a soft knock at my door. Grace stepped inside, holding a mug of tea. Neither of us spoke at first. Then she whispered the words that shattered whatever strength I still had left. I'm so sorry, Grandma. And for the first time in my life, I felt ashamed for raising my own son. After Grace left my room that night, I didn't sleep. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I lay beneath the thin basement blanket, staring at the ceiling, while the pipes inside the walls groaned softly above me. Every few minutes, I could hear footsteps crossing the kitchen floor upstairs. Cabinet doors opening, water running, normal family sounds. But none of it felt normal anymore. Because once someone humiliates you openly, something changes inside your heart. You stop feeling safe around them. Even silence begins to feel dangerous. Around 2 a.m, I finally sat up slowly and switched on the small lamp beside my bed. The basement room looked exactly how I felt. Temporary, unwanted. The walls were unfinished near the laundry corner, and the air always carried a faint smell of detergent and damp concrete. There were only 3 things in that room that actually belonged to me. My bed, a small dresser, and the cedar box Walter built with his own hands 32 years ago. I stared at that box for a long time before finally walking over to it. My fingers shook slightly as I lifted the lid. The smell hit me first. Old cedar wood and faded cologne. Walter. Inside were pieces of a life that no longer existed. Photographs, letters, his firefighter badge, the watch he wore every day for 20 years. And on top of everything else sat the envelope I hadn't opened in nearly 3 years. My name was written across the front in Walter's messy handwriting. For Aria. When you truly need to hear my voice again. I sank onto the edge of the bed, holding the envelope against my chest. Walter wrote that letter during the final month of his life. The cancer had already spread by then. Some mornings, he was too weak to stand without help, but he still worried more about me than himself, especially when it came to Ethan. Back then, I thought Walter was being unfair. Now I wondered if he had simply seen the truth long before I did. I finally opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside was yellowing at the folds. I could almost hear Walter's voice as I read. Aria. If you're reading this, then something has finally broken your heart badly enough that you opened the box before you were ready. First, I need you to remember something. You are not difficult to love. Please don't ever let loneliness convince you otherwise. Tears blurred my vision immediately. I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. Walter always knew exactly where my deepest fears lived, even after 40 years together. I kept reading. I know you'll spend the rest of your life trying to protect Ethan. That's who you are. You love until there's nothing left of yourself. But listen to me carefully, sweetheart. Love should never require humiliation. The room felt unbearably quiet. Upstairs, I heard faint laughter from the television. Life continuing while my entire world cracked open downstairs. Walter's words pulled me backward through time. I remembered the day Ethan was 16 and demanded a car we couldn't afford because all his friends had one. Walter said no immediately. Ethan slammed doors for days afterward. I was the one who secretly defended him. He's just emotional, I told Walter. But Walter only looked tired. No, he said quietly. He's learning that guilt works on you. At the time, I thought Walter was too harsh. Now, sitting in that basement room years later, I realized he had simply noticed patterns I refused to see. I continued reading. If Ethan ever starts measuring your worth by what you can give him, promise me you won't surrender your dignity just to keep his affection. A mother's love is supposed to guide a child, not fund their selfishness. My chest tightened painfully, because deep down, I already knew Walter had been right. There had been signs for years. The first time Ethan borrowed money and never repaid it. The way Vanessa always asked about property values. The conversations that suddenly stopped whenever I entered rooms. The way Ethan barely touched me anymore unless people were watching. I folded the letter slowly and stared at Walter's old watch resting inside the cedar box. Then my eyes drifted toward the manila folder beneath it. The will. Our original will. I hadn't looked at it in over 5 years. Walter and I created it shortly after his diagnosis became terminal. We sat inside Attorney Richard Hale's office, holding hands while pretending not to be terrified. Back then, everything felt simple. If Walter died first, everything went to me. When I died, nearly all assets transferred to Ethan. Because of course they would. He was our son, our only child. I pulled the folder out slowly and opened it on the bed. The numbers startled me more than I expected. The house Walter and I had owned before selling it. The retirement investments, savings, insurance. The small lake property Walter inherited from his brother years ago. Everything we built through decades of sacrifice. Everything Ethan now seemed to view as delayed ownership. I stared at my signature near the bottom of the document. Then I remembered something that made my stomach turn. About 6 months earlier, Ethan had casually asked me whether I'd updated my estate paperwork lately. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now the memory felt ugly. Another moment surfaced. Vanessa once saying, managing property gets complicated when people get older. People. Always people. Never Mom. Never Aria. I suddenly felt cold all over. And then another memory hit me so hard, I actually gasped. 3 weeks before my heart attack, Ethan had insisted I give him copies of my banking information in case of emergencies. I did it without hesitation. Because mothers trust their children, even when they shouldn't. A quiet knock startled me. I quickly wiped my eyes. Grandma Grace. I opened the door carefully. She stood there wearing oversized pajamas, holding another mug of tea. I saw your light on. Her eyes dropped toward the papers on my bed. For a second, panic flashed across her face. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. You shouldn't leave those upstairs where Dad can find them. The room went still. I stared at her. What do you mean? Grace hesitated immediately. Too late. She had already said too much. Grace, I whispered carefully. What do you know? She looked terrified now, like a child carrying secrets too heavy for her age. Finally, she swallowed hard. I heard Mom and Dad talking last week. Every nerve in my body tightened. Grace looked down at the floor. They thought you were asleep. My heart pounded harder. What did they say? Grace's voice broke. They were talking about what happens after... She couldn't finish the sentence. After I die. The words hung silently between us anyway. Then Grace whispered the sentence that changed everything. Dad said the house and money would finally solve all their problems. I felt something inside me collapse completely. Not because Ethan wanted the inheritance someday. That part was human. No. What destroyed me was realizing my son had already begun building his future around my absence. And suddenly, Walter's letter no longer felt like loving advice. It felt like a warning. I called Richard Hale at 12:47 in the morning. For a full minute before dialing, I just sat on the edge of my bed staring at his number on an old business card. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Not from fear, from grief. Because there's something devastating about realizing the people you would die for have already begun organizing their lives around your death. When Richard finally answered, his voice sounded groggy and confused. Aria, I'm sorry, I whispered immediately. I know it's late. There was rustling on the other end of the line, then the sound of a lamp clicking on. No, he said gently. Are you all right? That question nearly broke me. Nobody in that house had asked if I was all right in months. I need to see you, I said. Silence. Richard had been our family attorney for over 30 years. He handled Walter's retirement paperwork, our wills, property taxes, everything. He knew me too well. What happened? He asked carefully. I looked toward the basement ceiling. Somewhere above me, my son was sleeping peacefully after humiliating his mother at dinner. And suddenly, I couldn't bear protecting him anymore. I need to change my will. The line went completely silent. Then Richard exhaled slowly. Tomorrow morning, he said, 9 o'clock. I'll clear my schedule. Thank you. But before I could hang up, Richard stopped me. Aria? His voice had changed, more cautious now. There's something I think you should know before you come in. A strange feeling settled into my stomach immediately. What is it? Another pause. Then Richard spoke carefully, like a man stepping across thin ice. Ethan called me a few months ago. Every muscle in my body tightened. What about? Richard hesitated. I didn't mention it because at the time it seemed premature. My throat felt dry. Richard. He asked questions about estate transition, Richard admitted quietly. Power of attorney, medical authority, asset control. I gripped the phone tighter. He said he was just planning ahead after your heart attack. Planning ahead. God. I suddenly remembered Ethan insisting on organizing my medications after I moved in. Him asking for copies of my bank information. The way Vanessa once casually asked whether I'd considered long-term assisted living options. Pieces. Tiny, ugly pieces sliding together into a picture I no longer wanted to see. What exactly did he ask? I whispered. Richard sighed heavily. He specifically asked how competency evaluations work for elderly clients. The room tilted slightly around me. I sat down hard on the bed. What he asked, what happens if a parent becomes mentally unfit to manage finances? My chest tightened painfully. He thought I was losing my mind. No, Richard said quickly. He never said that directly. But he didn't need to. The implication hung there anyway. I closed my eyes. A memory surfaced instantly. 3 weeks earlier, I forgot where I placed my reading glasses. Vanessa laughed softly and said, Maybe it's time we start keeping a closer eye on things. At the time, Ethan didn't defend me. Now I understood why. "Oh my God," I whispered. Aria Richards said carefully, "I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily." But I was already alarmed. Terrified, actually. Because once someone begins questioning your competency, they stop seeing you as an equal human being. Every forgotten appointment becomes evidence. Every moment of sadness becomes instability. And older people. We know how quickly independence can disappear once family members decide we're inconvenient. "I want everything reviewed tomorrow," I said firmly. "Everything." "You got it." "And Richard?" "Yes. If anything happens to me before then?" My voice cracked. "I need you to promise me Ethan doesn't get control immediately." Silence again. Then Richard answered softly, "I promise." After we hung up, I sat there staring into the darkness for a very long time. I should have cried. Instead, I felt numb, like something inside me had quietly died. Around 2:30 in the morning, I finally heard footsteps coming downstairs. I quickly slid Walter's letter and the will back into the cedar box. A moment later, Ethan appeared at the bottom of the stairs. For one stupid second, hope rushed through me. Maybe he came to apologize. Maybe he realized what he'd done. But the expression on his face wasn't guilt. It was irritation. "You're still awake?" I nodded slowly. "Couldn't sleep." Ethan leaned against the doorway with his arms crossed. "You made things awkward tonight?" I actually stared at him in disbelief. "I made things awkward." He sighed heavily, like he was exhausted by me. "Mom Vanessa had guests over. You always bring the mood down talking about Dad." The words hit harder than I expected, because Walter wasn't some depressing story. He was my husband, Ethan's father, the man who spent his life protecting us. "You used to love hearing stories about him," I whispered. "That was years ago. Years ago. As if grief expired. As if love had a time limit." I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. The expensive watch, the tense jaw, the impatience in his eyes. And suddenly, I saw traces of Vanessa everywhere inside him. Not because she controlled him, because he allowed himself to become this. "You embarrassed me in front of strangers tonight," I said quietly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Oh, come on, Mom. I just asked you to stop. You fed me leftovers." It was food, he snapped. "Why are you acting like I starved you?" I felt something icy settle inside my chest. Because cruel people always reduce your pain into technicalities. It was food. It was a joke. You're too sensitive. That's how they avoid guilt. "I'm tired, Ethan." "So am I," he muttered immediately. Then came the sentence I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. "You don't realize how hard this has been on us too." Us. Not once did he say hard on him emotionally. Hard on us financially, logistically, personally. Like I was a problem everyone had to manage. "You asked me to move here," I reminded him softly. Ethan avoided my eyes. "Well, things changed." The room went quiet, and there it was. The truth, not spoken fully, but close enough. They no longer wanted me there. Not really. Maybe they had stopped wanting me there months ago. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "Look, just try to make things easier with Vanessa, okay?" I almost laughed. After everything that happened, he still wanted me to accommodate her comfort. Not my dignity. Her comfort. "I'm going to bed," I whispered. Ethan nodded quickly, relieved the conversation was ending. Then he turned to leave. But before climbing the stairs, he paused. "By the way," he said casually, "did you ever update your will after the heart attack?" Every nerve in my body froze. Slowly, I looked up at him. His expression looked almost too neutral, too careful. And in that moment, something inside me finally hardened. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. Pure, painful clarity. Because my son wasn't asking out of love. He was checking timelines. I forced myself to answer calmly. No, I lied softly. Ethan nodded once, then he disappeared upstairs. A few seconds later, I heard the basement door lock click into place above me. Maybe it had always locked automatically. Maybe not. But lying there alone in that cold basement room, listening to my son secure the house before going to sleep, I no longer felt like family. I felt like property. The next morning, I watched my son differently. That was the strange part. Ethan hadn't transformed overnight into someone cruel. The signs had been there for years, buried beneath excuses I kept making because mothers are experts at rewriting painful truths into softer versions we can survive. But once the illusion cracks, you start noticing everything. Every glance, every whisper, every silence. I left early for my appointment with Richard Hale before anyone else woke up except Grace. She caught me putting on my coat near the basement stairs. "Where are you going?" she whispered sleepily. I hesitated. Then I smiled softly, taking care of some grown-up business. She studied my face carefully, almost like she already understood more than she should. "Are you okay, Grandma?" There it was again. That question nobody else in the house ever asked. I touched her cheek gently. "I will be." Outside, cold October air hit my face hard enough to wake something inside me. The sky hung low and gray over Cleveland, while leaves scraped across the driveway in the wind. For the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not peace. Control. Richard greeted me personally when I arrived at his office downtown. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too. But his eyes softened immediately when he saw me. "Aria." I nearly cried hearing kindness in someone's voice. His office still smelled like leather books and coffee. Walter used to joke that Richard's office smelled like expensive divorces and bad decisions. That memory hurt. Richard closed the door behind us carefully. Then he looked directly at me. "Tell me everything." And so I did. The leftovers, the humiliation, the questions about competency, the basement room, the conversations Grace overheard. I talked for nearly 40 minutes straight, while Richard sat silently listening with his hands folded together. When I finally stopped, the room felt unbearably quiet. Richard removed his glasses slowly. "I'm very sorry, Aria." I nodded once. Then I asked the question I'd been terrified to say aloud. "Am I overreacting?" Richard looked genuinely stunned. "No." The answer came instantly, firmly. That alone almost shattered me, because abuse inside families survives through self-doubt. Victims constantly question whether they're being too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic, especially older women. Richard leaned forward carefully. "I've worked with families for 35 years, he said quietly. "And I can tell you this, when adult children begin discussing competency, before there's any actual cognitive decline, it's usually about control." My stomach twisted. He opened a folder on his desk. "There's more." The way he said it made my chest tighten immediately. What Richard hesitated. Then he slid several printed documents toward me. "These are public financial filings." I stared down at the pages blankly. Ethan's company name sat across the top. Moore Custom Renovations, LLC. "What is this?" Richard sighed heavily. "Your son's business is in serious financial trouble." For a second, I couldn't breathe. "What kind of trouble, debt?" He pointed towards several highlighted sections. "Business loans? Missed payments? Tax issues?" My eyes blurred. This can't be right. I'm afraid it is. Suddenly, dozens of conversations from the past year replayed differently in my mind. Ethan pressuring me to move in quickly after my heart attack. Vanessa obsessing over property values. The subtle comments about future planning. God, it wasn't just greed. It was desperation. They need money, I whispered. Richard nodded grimly. And they likely view your assets as the solution. I stared at Walter's old wedding ring on my finger. The one I still wore every day. All those years Walter and I sacrificed for Ethan. And now, our life savings had become his emergency exit strategy? I failed him, I whispered suddenly. Richard frowned immediately. No. I raised him to think love meant rescuing him from consequences. That's not the same thing. But wasn't it? I thought about every bill I paid for Ethan. Every bailout. Every excuse. Every moment I confused enabling with motherhood. Richard broke the silence carefully. What would you like to do? The old version of me would have answered differently. The old Aria would have protected Ethan no matter the cost. But something had changed after that dinner table humiliation. Because once your own child strips away your dignity, publicly survival instincts finally begin overpowering guilt. I want to change everything, I said quietly. Richard nodded once. All right. For the next hour, we reviewed every asset Walter and I had built together. The lake property, the retirement accounts, savings, insurance, investment portfolios. Each item carried memories heavier than numbers. That lake property Walter proposed to me there during a thunderstorm. Our retirement fund built from decades of missed vacations and overtime shifts. Nothing about that money came easily. It was our life. And suddenly I understood something clearly. I did not owe anyone my suffering as inheritance. I want a trust established for Grace's education, I said firmly. Richard smiled slightly. I think that's wise. And I want donations made to elderly housing programs. His eyebrows lifted. That's quite generous. No, I said softly. It's necessary. Because now I understood how invisible older people become once usefulness fades. Richard continued taking notes. What about Ethan? There it was. The hardest question. I stared out the office window at downtown Cleveland traffic moving below us. For a moment, all I saw was a little boy riding on Walter's shoulders at Cedar Point. My son laughing. My son before life twisted into this ugliness. Tears burned my eyes immediately. I still love him, I whispered. Richard's face softened. I know, and I hate that I still love him. Because that was the cruelest part of motherhood. Even after betrayal, your heart keeps remembering earlier versions of your child. Richard waited patiently. Finally, I exhaled slowly. He'll receive something, I said, but not enough to reward this behavior. Richard nodded carefully. Then he asked one final question. Are you afraid of how he'll react? I opened my mouth to answer automatically. No. But the truth stopped me. Because yes, a little. Not because Ethan would hurt me physically, but because I feared the coldness, the blame, the cruelty that always comes when entitled people realize access is being taken away. Yes, I admitted quietly. Richard leaned back in his chair. Then I strongly suggest you do not discuss these changes with anyone yet. I nodded immediately. Especially not while living in their home, he added. The words settled heavily between us, because deep down, we both knew something neither of us wanted to say aloud. I wasn't safe there anymore, not emotionally, maybe not financially either. As I gathered my purse to leave, Richard handed me a sealed envelope. What's this? Walter asked me to give it to you only if things ever became difficult with Ethan. My breath caught instantly. Inside was a copy of a private financial trust Walter established years earlier. Protection money, hidden assets, emergency funds only I could access. At the bottom sat Walter's signature, and beneath it a single handwritten sentence. If our son ever mistakes your kindness for weakness, promise me you'll finally choose yourself. I stared at those words until my vision blurred completely. Because after 43 years of marriage, Walter still knew me better than anyone alive. When I came home from Richard's office that afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels staged. Vanessa's car sat in the driveway, but the television wasn't on, and music wasn't echoing through the kitchen like usual. Even the dog next door seemed quieter than normal. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. Tension. Ethan appeared from the living room almost immediately. There you are. His voice sounded casual. Too casual. I forced myself to stay calm. I had errands. Ethan nodded slowly, studying me longer than usual. You were gone all morning. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not concern. Tracking. I stopped for coffee afterward, I lied. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan smiled faintly. Well, Vanessa and I were getting worried. Worried? Funny how people can weaponize gentle words. I walked toward the kitchen, carefully setting my purse down near the counter. Vanessa stood there pretending to organize groceries. Pretending. Because the milk had been sitting on the counter long enough to sweat. She turned toward me with that polished little smile. There she is. I nodded quietly. Hi, Vanessa. Her eyes drifted briefly toward my purse, then back to my face. How are you feeling today? Again, it sounded kind on the surface, but underneath it I heard calculation, assessing, monitoring. I suddenly remembered Richard's warning. Do not discuss these changes while living in their home. The realization made every room feel smaller. Grace came downstairs, then backpack still hanging off one shoulder. The moment she saw me, relief flashed across her face. Grandma. That one word sounded more genuine than everything Ethan and Vanessa had said combined. I smiled softly. Hey, sweetheart. Vanessa clapped her hands suddenly. Perfect timing. We're ordering dinner tonight. That surprised me. Vanessa hated spending extra money on takeout. Then Ethan casually added, thought we could all spend more time together. A chill crawled up my spine. Because suddenly, they were trying too hard. At dinner, Ethan acted almost cheerful. He asked about my doctor appointments. Refilled my water glass himself. Even laughed at one of my stories. If someone from outside had watched us, they would have thought we were a perfectly loving family. But once you've seen the truth behind someone's eyes, performances become obvious. Especially maternal performances. I noticed Vanessa and Ethan exchanging glances repeatedly whenever they thought I wasn't looking. Tiny looks. Silent communication. Then came the first real warning. Halfway through dinner, Ethan casually said, You know, Mom, we should probably start organizing your paperwork eventually. There it was. I kept my expression neutral. What paperwork? Oh, you know. He shrugged. Medical stuff, financial things, just in case, just in case. Vanessa jumped in immediately. It's actually very responsible. My coworker's mother passed away last year, and nobody could access anything. Passed away. Not died. Not became sick. Passed away. Clean language for ugly intentions. I cut a small piece of chicken slowly. I'm managing fine. Vanessa smiled tightly. Of course you are. But her tone implied the opposite. Grace barely touched her food the entire meal. She looked nervous. Every time Ethan brought up finances or paperwork, her shoulders stiffened slightly. And then, I noticed something else. Fear. Not for herself, for me. After dinner, Ethan offered to carry my dishes to the sink. That almost made me laugh out loud. 3 days earlier, he fed me leftovers like a stray animal. Now suddenly, he was attentive, careful, helpful. Because now, he sensed something shifting. Manipulative people always notice when control begins slipping away. Later that night, I sat downstairs reading Walter's letter again when I heard soft footsteps near my door. Grace. She slipped inside quietly and closed the door behind her. "You okay?" I whispered. Instead of answering, she pulled her phone from her hoodie pocket. Her hands were shaking. "I need to show you something." The fear in her voice made my heart pound immediately. "Grace." She sat beside me on the bed. Then she opened a voice recording app. "I didn't know if I should tell you," she whispered. "But I can't keep pretending anymore." My stomach dropped. "What is this?" Grace looked close to tears. "A recording." Every nerve in my body tightened instantly. "Of what?" She swallowed hard. "Mom and Dad." The room went completely silent. For a moment, I honestly couldn't breathe. "Grace." "I know it's wrong," she whispered quickly. "I know I shouldn't have recorded them, but they kept talking about you when they thought I was asleep." My chest tightened painfully. She pressed play. At first, all I heard was muffled kitchen noise. Then Vanessa's voice. Sharp. Cold. "We can't keep waiting forever, Ethan." My blood ran cold immediately. Ethan answered in a tired voice. "What do you want me to do? She's 70. 70, not Mom. Not Aria. Just a number." The recording crackled softly. Then Vanessa continued. "If she signs the property transfer, we can refinance everything." My hand flew to my mouth. Ethan sighed heavily. "She's being stubborn." "I'm serious," Vanessa snapped. "Your mother sitting on those assets while we drown is insane." Assets. Not memories. Not Walter's lifetime of sacrifice. Assets. Grace looked down at the floor while the recording continued. Then came the sentence that shattered something deep inside me. "She's living like she has forever," Vanessa muttered. Silence. And then Ethan laughed softly. Actually laughed. Not cruelly, not dramatically. Just tired amusement, like discussing an inconvenience. "I know," he said quietly. I stopped the recording immediately. I physically couldn't hear another second. The room spun around me. Grace started crying beside me. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I didn't know what to do." I pulled her into my arms instantly, and suddenly, I wasn't crying for myself anymore. I was crying for her, because no child should ever discover their parents are capable of speaking that way about family. Grace buried her face into my shoulder. "I don't recognize them anymore. Neither did I. But the horrifying truth. Maybe this wasn't sudden. Maybe money had simply exposed who they already were underneath." After several minutes, Grace finally pulled away. "You can't tell them I showed you this." "I won't. They'll be furious." I looked at her carefully. "You're scared of them." Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. I reached for her hand slowly. "Listen to me," I whispered. "None of this is your fault." Her eyes filled again. "I should have said something sooner." "No," I said firmly. "You are not responsible for fixing grown adults." But as soon as the words left my mouth, guilt hit me like a punch to the chest. Because wasn't that exactly what I had trained Ethan to expect his entire life? That someone else would always clean up his messes? Grace wiped her face quietly. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding myself. "What are you going to do now?" I looked toward Walter's cedar box sitting beside the bed. toward the revised estate papers hidden inside, toward the future that suddenly felt terrifying and strangely freeing at the same time. Then I looked back at my granddaughter, and for the first time since all of this began, I answered honestly. I think I whispered softly, I'm finally done protecting people who would never protect me. 3 days later, I signed the new will. It's strange how something so life-changing can happen in complete silence. No dramatic music, no courtroom speeches. Just an elderly woman sitting inside a quiet office holding a pen while realizing she was finally choosing herself for the first time in decades. Richard Hale reviewed the paperwork carefully while I sat across from him near the window. Outside, Cleveland traffic moved beneath gray November skies. People hurried down sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that my entire understanding of family had shattered within the span of a single week. You're certain? Richard asked gently. I looked down at the documents one more time. The revised estate plan reflected everything Walter and I spent a lifetime building. But now it also reflected something else, truth. Not fantasy, not guilt. Truth. I'm certain. Richard nodded quietly. Then he slid the first document toward me. The Educational Trust for Grace Moore. My hands trembled slightly as I signed. I thought about my granddaughter sitting downstairs beside me late at night, whispering apologies for pain she never caused. I thought about the fear in her eyes whenever Ethan and Vanessa argued about money. Most of all, I thought about how carefully she still protected my dignity in a house where everyone else had stopped seeing me as human. Grace deserved freedom, not debt, not manipulation. Freedom. She'll receive access when she turns 21, I asked softly. Richard nodded. Enough for college housing and living expenses. Good. At least one person in this family would have a chance to build a future untouched by greed. Next came the charitable donations. A portion of my retirement investments would go toward housing assistance programs for elderly women abandoned or financially exploited by family members. The irony almost made me laugh. Years ago, I would have considered women like that tragic strangers. Now I understood how easily loneliness traps older people inside unhealthy homes. How humiliation becomes normalized. How dependence slowly steals your voice. Richard studied me carefully while I signed the final charity forms. You know, he said quietly, most people in your position would focus entirely on punishment. I paused. Punishment. Was that what this was? Maybe part of me wanted Ethan to hurt the way I hurt. Maybe part of me wanted him shocked when he realized the inheritance he'd mentally spent was no longer waiting for him. But deeper than that, I wanted something else. I wanted my husband's sacrifices protected from people who no longer respected what those sacrifices cost. No, I whispered finally. I'm just tired of rewarding cruelty. Richard's eyes softened. Then came the hardest section. Ethan's inheritance, or what remained of it. I stared at the numbers for a long time. Enough to help if he truly changed someday. Not enough to erase consequences. Not enough to validate what he'd become. Richard spoke gently. You can still revise things again later if circumstances change. I nodded slowly, but deep inside I knew something important. This wasn't really about money anymore. It was about dignity. And once dignity dies inside a relationship, love starts suffocating beside it. I signed the final page carefully. Richard gathered the documents into folders. Then he looked at me over folded hands. There's one more issue. Immediately my stomach tightened. What now? The house. I frowned slightly. What about it? Richard exhaled slowly. Technically, the funds used for Ethan's property down payment originated from your jointly held retirement liquidation after Walter passed. I blinked. Yes. Richard slid another document toward me. You still hold partial financial interest through the original investment structure. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then, realization hit slowly. You're saying? The house is not entirely theirs. The room went completely still. Richard adjusted his glasses. The paperwork was structured loosely because Ethan needed quick approval at the time. You retained protected equity rights connected to the initial contribution. I stared at him in disbelief. All this time. All those moments Vanessa treated me like I was freeloading under her roof. And Walter and I had partially funded the entire home. Richard continued carefully. I'm not saying you own the house, but legally your financial contribution matters more than they probably realize. I suddenly remembered Vanessa once saying, "This house belongs to us now." Not entirely apparently. A strange emotion moved through me then. Not triumph, sadness, because Ethan knew where that money came from. Walter's life insurance. Walter's death. The money I cried over while signing withdrawal papers after burying my husband. And somehow my son still found a way to resent me inside the very home my grief helped purchase. Richard leaned back slowly. I strongly suggest securing your remaining independent accounts immediately. I already transferred the emergency trust, I said quietly. Good. And Richard? Yes, if Ethan discovers the changes before I'm ready. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Then you leave immediately. The seriousness in his voice frightened me. You think it could get that bad? I think financial desperation changes people? I thought about the recording Grace played for me. We can't keep waiting forever. My stomach turned. Before leaving, Richard handed me several sealed envelopes. What are these copies of everything? I held the papers tightly against my chest. Proof, protection, boundaries. Things mothers rarely allow themselves to have with their children. When I arrived home later that afternoon, Vanessa greeted me at the door with unusual warmth. There you are, too bright, too cheerful, immediately suspicious. She took my coat before I could answer. You've been out so much lately. There it was again. Monitoring, tracking. I've had appointments. With who? The question came too quickly. I smiled faintly. Doctors. Errands. Vanessa studied my face carefully. Then Ethan walked into the hallway. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. They were both trying to figure out whether I knew something. Mom, Ethan said casually, "We're planning a little birthday dinner for you this weekend." I froze slightly. My birthday isn't for another 2 weeks. Vanessa laughed too loudly. Well, schedules are crazy. Ethan stepped closer. We just want to do something nice. Nice. The word almost made me sick, because now I could see the performance clearly. The sudden kindness, the extra attention, the fake concern. They sensed distance growing, and manipulative people panic when control starts slipping. That evening, Grace came downstairs while I organized the legal documents inside Walter's cedar box. Did you do it? She whispered carefully. I looked at her quietly for a moment, then I nodded. Yes, her shoulders dropped slightly with relief, but fear still lingered in her eyes. Are you scared? The question caught me off guard. I thought about Ethan upstairs, my son, the little boy Walter once carried through amusement parks on his shoulders, the teenager who used to kiss my forehead before football games, the man who now discussed my death like a financial timeline. And somehow, even after all of it, part of me still mourned him like someone already gone. Yes, I admitted softly. Grace looked down. I think they're planning something. Cold spread through my chest immediately. What do you mean? She hesitated. Then she whispered the words that made my blood run cold. I heard Dad say this weekend is their last chance to handle things peacefully. Saturday arrived wrapped in fake warmth. That's the best way I can describe it. Everything looked beautiful on the surface, but underneath it all, something rotten pulsed quietly beneath every smile. Vanessa transformed the dining room into something out of a magazine spread. Candles flickered along the table. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases. Soft jazz music drifted through the house, while expensive catered food covered nearly every surface in the kitchen. Too much effort. Too much perfection. Especially for a birthday dinner happening 2 weeks early. The moment I walked upstairs, dressed in my navy blue sweater, Vanessa gasped dramatically. Aria, you look wonderful. I almost looked behind me to see who she was talking to. Grace stood near the staircase, watching everything silently. Her expression remained tense, like she was waiting for a car crash nobody else could see coming. Ethan kissed my cheek when guests began arriving. The affection startled me so badly, I nearly flinched. You deserve a nice night, Mom. There it was again. Performance. A loving son, costume worn over desperation. The guest list was carefully chosen. Vanessa's co-workers, a few neighbors, 2 couples Ethan knew through business. And strangely enough, attorney Richard Hale. I froze the moment I saw him walk through the front door. Our eyes met briefly. He gave the smallest nod imaginable. Understood. Controlled. Professional. Relief flooded my chest so quickly I almost cried, because now I knew I wasn't walking into this alone. Vanessa moved quickly to greet Richard. Richard. We're so glad you could make it. Her voice sounded overly bright. Richard smiled politely. Wouldn't miss Aria's celebration. Celebration. God. The word felt cruel somehow. Dinner started smoothly enough. Too smoothly. People laughed loudly. Wine glasses clinked. Vanessa played perfect hostess, while Ethan moved around the table pretending to be the attentive son everyone assumed he was. At one point, one of the neighbors smiled at me warmly. You're lucky to have family like this. I nearly choked on my water. Lucky. That word stayed lodged painfully in my chest all evening. Halfway through dinner, Ethan stood and tapped his wine glass gently. I just want to say something about my mom. Every conversation quieted immediately. Ethan smiled at me, and for one terrible second, I saw flashes of the little boy he used to be. The boy who made me handmade birthday cards with crooked spelling. The boy who cried after Walter's funeral because he was afraid I'd feel lonely. That memory hurt worse than cruelty ever could. Mom's been through a lot these past few years, Ethan said carefully. And we've all been trying to support each other as a family. I noticed Richard watching silently from across the table. Vanessa squeezed Ethan's arm supportively. We just want what's best for her, she added. There it was, the setup. I could feel it coming now. Grace could too. Her entire body looked tense. Ethan sat back down slowly. Then casually, he slid a folder across the table toward me. There's actually one little thing we wanted to discuss tonight. The room instantly felt smaller. My pulse began thudding hard inside my chest. Vanessa smiled reassuringly. Nothing stressful. That sentence alone guaranteed stress. I looked down at the folder without touching it. What is it? Just estate planning paperwork, Ethan said smoothly. Simple precautionary stuff. Precautionary. I glanced toward Richard briefly. His expression remained unreadable. Vanessa leaned forward. With your health scare this year, we thought it was important to make sure things are organized properly. Things. Always things. Never feelings. Never family. Just management. One of the guests laughed awkwardly. Oh, I need to do that with my mother too. The comment made me physically ill. Like elderly parents were paperwork projects waiting to happen. Ethan pushed the folder slightly closer. If anything ever happened unexpectedly, this would allow us to help immediately. Us. I opened the folder slowly. The moment I saw the legal terminology, my stomach dropped. Power of attorney, asset transfer authorization, medical decision rights, not precautionary paperwork, control paperwork. And suddenly, I understood why they invited witnesses tonight. This wasn't about helping me. This was about pressuring me publicly. If I resisted, I would look paranoid, difficult, confused, exactly the kind of elderly woman whose competency might eventually be questioned. Vanessa's voice softened carefully. We just want to avoid future complications. Future complications, meaning my existence. Grace suddenly spoke for the first time all evening. Mom, Vanessa's smile tightened instantly. What sweetheart? Grace looked pale. Maybe tonight isn't the best night for this. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Ethan chuckled lightly. It's fine, Grace. No, it wasn't fine. Not even close. I looked down at the paperwork again. There it was in black and white, immediate financial authority upon signature. Not after death, not after medical incapacity. Immediately. My son wanted access now. My hands went cold. And then Ethan made the mistake that changed everything. Just sign here, Mom, he said casually. Then we can stop worrying. We, again. Always we. As though I wasn't sitting right there. As though my life had already become a shared logistical burden. I slowly lifted my eyes toward him. And for the first time in my life, I let silence work for me instead of against me. The room grew uncomfortable quickly. Vanessa laughed nervously. Aria's always been cautious with paperwork. Cautious. Another carefully chosen word. Richard finally leaned forward calmly. May I take a look? Ethan froze slightly. Only slightly. But I noticed. Sure, he said. Richard adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the documents carefully, while the room sat in tense silence. I watched Ethan's jaw tighten more, with every page Richard turned. Finally, Richard closed the folder slowly. Then he looked directly at Ethan. These are not standard emergency planning documents. Dead silence. Vanessa spoke too quickly. Of course they are. No, Richard said evenly. These forms would transfer immediate financial authority and partial asset control upon execution. The air vanished from the room. One of Vanessa's co-workers blinked awkwardly. Oh. Ethan's face darkened instantly. It's just precautionary. Richard remained calm. Then why is there language allowing immediate discretionary liquidation access? Liquidation? My stomach twisted. The room shifted suddenly. Not physically. Socially. People were looking at Ethan differently now. Really looking. Vanessa forced a tight smile. You're making this sound worse than it is. Richard folded his hands together calmly. No, I'm describing exactly what the documents say. Ethan's voice sharpened. Mom asked us for help after her heart attack. No, that wasn't true. They offered, and now they were trying to convert kindness into ownership. I looked around the table slowly. Every face suddenly looked uncomfortable, except Grace. Grace looked terrified, because unlike everyone else, she knew this wasn't misunderstanding. This was strategy. Ethan turned toward me quickly. Mom, don't let this become some huge dramatic thing. Dramatic. There it was. The favorite word of people minimizing someone else's pain. I looked at my son quietly for several long seconds. Then I asked the question that made the entire room freeze. If I sign this tonight? I paused carefully. What exactly do you gain immediately? Ethan opened his mouth. But before he could answer, Richard spoke first. Control. The silence afterward felt endless, and for the very first time since Walter died, I watched fear enter my son's eyes instead of mine. Nobody moved after Richard said the word control. Not Ethan. Not Vanessa. Not the guests sitting frozen around the dining table, pretending not to witness a family collapse in real time. Even the soft jazz music playing through the kitchen speakers suddenly sounded sinister. Ethan recovered first. His face tightened instantly into irritation. "Richard, come on," he snapped. "That's an unfair way to describe it." Richard remained perfectly calm. "It's an accurate way to describe it." Vanessa laughed nervously, though the panic in her eyes was becoming impossible to hide. "This is ridiculous," she said quickly. "We're talking about helping family." Family. Funny how people suddenly rediscover that word when money gets threatened. I sat quietly at the table, staring at the paperwork in front of me. For weeks, I had questioned myself. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe grief had made me suspicious. But now I could see it clearly. Not because of the documents, because of Ethan's face. He didn't look hurt. He looked cornered. One of the neighbors cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I'm sure everyone means well." No one answered him. Grace sat completely still beside me, fingers clenched tightly beneath the table. I could feel tension radiating off her like heat. Ethan suddenly leaned toward me with forced patience. "Mom, you're blowing this out of proportion." There it was again. The rewriting of reality. A classic move. Minimize, confuse, redirect. I looked at him quietly. "Am I?" "Yes." He exhaled sharply and pointed toward the paperwork. "This is basic planning. You're getting older. Older, not sick, not incapable, just older." And somehow he made the word sound like a diagnosis. Vanessa jumped in quickly. "After your heart attack, we realized how unprepared everything was. Everything. Again. Always reducing my life into administrative inconvenience." Richard folded the documents neatly. "These forms grant immediate discretionary authority over Ms. Moore's finances and assets." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's standard." "No," Richard replied calmly. "It isn't." The room went silent again. I noticed one of Vanessa's co-workers slowly lowering her wine glass, suddenly very interested in the conversation. Because people can sense greed the same way animals sense storms. Ethan rubbed his forehead dramatically. "Oh my God, Mom, nobody's trying to steal from you." "Steal. Interesting word choice. I hadn't used it." "He had." I finally spoke softly. "Then why didn't you tell me what these papers actually were?" Ethan stared at me. "We did." "No," I said quietly. "You called them precautionary?" Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly. "Because they are precautionary." I turned toward her slowly. "Would either of you sign documents giving me immediate control over your finances?" Vanessa blinked. Ethan scoffed. "That's completely different." There it was. Different because my independence no longer counted to them the same way theirs did. Richard carefully placed the paperwork back inside the folder. "I strongly recommend Aria not sign anything tonight." The shift in Ethan's expression frightened me. Not because he looked violent, because he looked desperate. Real desperation. The kind people usually hide under politeness until they realize the situation is slipping away. Richard Ethan said through clenched teeth, "This is a family matter." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm aware." Vanessa forced another smile toward the guests. I think everyone's misunderstanding our intentions. But nobody looked convinced anymore, especially not after Grace suddenly spoke. You should stop lying. Every head at the table turned toward her instantly. Vanessa's face lost color immediately. Grace. No, Grace, whispered shakily. I'm tired of pretending. My heart started pounding. Ethan's voice hardened instantly. This isn't your business. Yes, it is. Grace shot back, tears filling her eyes. You talk about Grandma like she's already dead. The entire room froze. Vanessa stood up too quickly. Grace, enough. But Grace was crying now. Real crying. Months of fear and guilt finally breaking open. You said she was costing too much money, Grace shouted. I heard both of you. Vanessa's face turned ghost white. Ethan looked horrified. Grace and Dad said everything would be easier once the house became yours. One of the guests actually gasped softly. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I didn't know already, because hearing it spoken aloud in front of strangers made it final somehow. Real. Vanessa pointed sharply toward Grace. You recorded private conversations? Grace flinched instantly. Ah, there it was. Not denial, not shame, concern about evidence. Richard noticed it too. I could tell from the way his expression changed slightly. Ethan stood abruptly from the table. This is unbelievable. I looked up at my son slowly. No, I whispered. What's unbelievable is realizing your child sees your death as financial relief. The words hit him hard. I saw it. For one brief second, guilt flashed across his face. Then anger buried it immediately. That's not what this is. Then tell me what it is, I asked quietly. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there was no innocent explanation left. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. We've sacrificed a lot for you. I actually laughed softly. The sound startled even me. Sacrificed. Walter and I spent 40 years sacrificing. Working overtime, missing vacations, building stability brick by brick. Meanwhile, Vanessa called, letting me live in the basement of a house partially funded by Walter's death, benefits a sacrifice. The cruelty of that nearly took my breath away. You fed me leftovers like garbage, I said softly. Nobody moved, nobody even blinked. I continued before my courage disappeared. You humiliated me in front of strangers. You questioned my competency behind my back. You discussed my death like a business timeline. Ethan's face twisted. That's not fair. No, I whispered. None of this has been fair. The room felt unbearably still. Then Ethan made the mistake that destroyed whatever sympathy remained in the room. You don't understand the pressure we're under. There it was, not remorse. Pressure, money, debt, consequences. Finally, one of Ethan's business friends spoke carefully. How bad is it? Ethan froze. Vanessa immediately snapped, That's private. But silence answered loudly enough. The friend looked uncomfortable. I heard the commercial property deal collapsed. Ethan stared at him furiously. That has nothing to do with this, except it had everything to do with this. Richard folded his hands together calmly. Financial stress does not justify coercive estate tactics. The word coercive hit the room like broken glass. Vanessa looked furious now. You're making us sound criminal. Richard's expression never changed. I'm describing behavior. Grace quietly reached for my hand under the table. I squeezed hers gently, and suddenly, something inside me settled. Not because I enjoyed exposing them. I didn't. This was still my son, my child. But for the first time in years, I was no longer the only person carrying the truth. Everyone could see it now. the manipulation, the greed, the entitlement. Ethan looked around the table, desperately realizing the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody saw him as the devoted son anymore. Now they saw calculation, and that terrified him. Finally, he turned toward me again. "Mom," he said tightly, "whatever Richard told you has poisoned your thinking." Poisoned. Interesting, because protecting myself suddenly counted as corruption in his eyes. I looked at him carefully. Then I said the sentence that changed everything forever. "No, Ethan." My voice stayed calm. "Seeing who you've become is what changed my thinking." His entire face went still, and before anyone could speak again, I reached into my purse, then slowly placed the revised estate documents onto the dinner table. I already changed the will. The silence afterward felt endless. Nobody breathed after I said the words. I already changed the will. The entire dining room froze in stunned silence while candlelight flickered across faces that no longer knew where to look. Ethan stared at the documents on the table like they were written in another language. Vanessa looked pale enough to collapse. Grace squeezed my hand beneath the table so tightly it almost hurt. And me, for the first time in years, I finally felt calm, not happy, not victorious, just free from the exhausting burden of pretending everything was okay. Ethan recovered first, what his voice came out sharp and hollow at the same time. I looked directly at him. "The will has already been revised." Vanessa let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious." Richard spoke quietly beside her. "She's completely serious." Ethan grabbed the folder from the table, immediately flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The guests sat frozen in horrified silence. Nobody even pretended to eat anymore. I watched my son's face carefully while he scanned the documents. Shock, confusion, then anger, pure anger. "You gave money to charities," he snapped suddenly. "Not Mom. Why would you do this?" "Not did we hurt you that badly?" "No." His first reaction was outrage over money leaving the family. That alone told everyone at the table exactly who he had become. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. "Yes." Vanessa leaned forward sharply. "This is insane." I looked at her calmly. "No. Feeding your husband's mother leftovers like an unwanted animal was insane." The room went dead silent again. Vanessa's face flushed instantly. "That's not what happened." "Oh, really?" My voice stayed soft. That seemed to unsettle them more than yelling would have, because calm people are harder to manipulate. "You humiliated me in front of strangers," I continued quietly. "And you expected me to keep rewarding you for it." Ethan slammed the papers down onto the table. "So this is revenge." The word stung. Because part of me feared maybe he was right. Maybe pain had influenced my decisions more than I wanted to admit. But then I looked at Grace. At the fear she'd carried for months. At the way Ethan and Vanessa discussed my death like a delayed financial transaction. And suddenly, my guilt disappeared again. "No," I whispered. "This is consequence." Ethan laughed bitterly. "You're choosing strangers over your own son." I stared at him in disbelief. Strangers. The elderly women losing homes after families drained their savings. The charities helping forgotten widows survive. Grace. People who still treated me like a human being? No. Those weren't strangers anymore. "You stopped acting like my son a long time ago," I said quietly. The words visibly hit him. For 1 second, real hurt flickered across his face. But Vanessa stepped in immediately. "This is all Richard's fault," she snapped. "He manipulated you." Richard remained perfectly composed. Aria made her own decisions. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. She's emotional. There it was, the oldest trick in the book. Reduce older women into irrational feelings whenever they stop obeying. I looked directly at Vanessa. No, I said calmly. I was emotional when I kept making excuses for people who disrespected me. Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because the truth had become too visible now. One of the guests finally stood awkwardly. I think maybe we should leave. Nobody stopped them. Within minutes, chairs scraped against the floor while uncomfortable apologies filled the room. Some guests avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked at Ethan with barely hidden disgust. The illusion of the perfect family had shattered completely. Good. I was tired of protecting appearances that protected nobody. After the front door finally closed behind the last guest, silence swallowed the house. Only family remained now. The real version. Ethan turned toward me slowly. His face looked completely different without the performance. Harder. Colder. You embarrassed me tonight. I almost smiled. The irony was breathtaking. You fed me leftovers in silence, I whispered. You humiliated me first. That was one dinner. No, I said softly. It was years. The words echoed through the dining room. Years of disrespect. Years of dismissive comments. Years of being treated like an inconvenient obligation instead of a mother. Ethan paced a few steps away, running both hands through his hair. You have no idea how much pressure I'm under right now. There it was again, always back to him. His stress, his fear, his problems. Never once had he truly asked about mine. What happened to you? I asked quietly. The question stopped him cold. For a second, he actually looked lost, like he didn't know how to answer. Then Vanessa answered for him. Life happened. I looked at her carefully. No, I whispered. Greed happened. Vanessa's expression hardened instantly. You think you're some victim here? I laughed softly. The sound surprised all of us. Do you know what's funny? I said quietly. I spent months wondering if I was imagining all this. Nobody spoke. I kept telling myself maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe grief made me difficult. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced myself to continue. Then my son handed me cold leftovers and told me to stay quiet. Ethan looked away immediately, not because he regretted it, because now he finally understood how ugly it sounded out loud. Grace suddenly stood up from the table. You owe Grandma an apology? Vanessa snapped instantly. Grace, stay out of this. No! Her voice shook violently, but she kept going. You both talk about her like she's already gone. Ethan looked exhausted now. You don't understand adult problems. Grace's face twisted with disbelief. Adult problems don't make you cruel. The room fell silent again. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. Grace had more integrity at 17 than the adults surrounding her. Ethan pointed toward the paperwork angrily. So what now? You're just cutting me out completely? No. I looked him directly in the eyes. You'll still receive something. Hope flashed across his face instantly. Then I watched it disappear when I continued. But not enough to reward this behavior. His jaw tightened. So that's it? No, I whispered. That's not it. I slowly reached into my purse again. This time, I removed Walter's letter. The one he wrote before he died. I spent weeks asking myself where I failed you, I said quietly. Then I reread your father's words. Ethan froze the moment he heard Walter mentioned. I unfolded the letter carefully. He told me something years ago that I refused to believe. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked directly at my son before reading aloud. A mother's love should guide a child, I whispered, not protect them from becoming selfish. The room felt unbearably still. Ethan's eyes filled instantly. For the first time all night, I finally saw something real break through his anger. Not rage, pain, because no matter what he'd become, Walter still mattered to him. And deep down, I think Ethan knew his father would have been ashamed of the man standing there now. I folded the letter slowly. Then I asked the question that had haunted me for weeks. When did you stop seeing me as your mother? Ethan opened his mouth, but he couldn't answer, because the truth was too ugly for even him to say aloud. Ethan didn't answer me. He just stood there in the dining room with Walter's words hanging between us like smoke after a fire. When did you stop seeing me as your mother? It was a simple question, but simple questions can be the most dangerous ones when the answer exposes a soul. His eyes shifted toward Vanessa first. That hurt more than I expected. Even in that moment when the truth had finally cracked the room open, my son still looked to his wife before he looked inside himself. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is emotional manipulation, she said coldly. I turned toward her slowly. No, Vanessa. Emotional manipulation is throwing a fake birthday dinner 2 weeks early, so an old woman feels pressured to sign away her rights in front of guests. Her mouth opened, then closed. Richard remained beside the table, silent but alert. I could tell he was watching every movement Ethan made. Grace stood near me trembling, but she didn't sit down. Ethan suddenly laughed under his breath. It wasn't amusement. It was the laugh of a man cornered with no graceful exit. You know what he said? Fine. You want the truth. My chest tightened. Yes, I whispered. For once. His face hardened. We are drowning. The words came out sharp. Vanessa whispered, Ethan. No, he snapped. She wants truth. Let's give her truth. He pointed at the papers on the table. My business is collapsing. The bank is calling every week. Contractors are threatening liens. I owe more money than I can explain without sounding like an idiot. The room felt colder with every sentence. I didn't speak. I let him continue. I tried to keep everything together, he said, voice rising. I tried to protect this family. I tried to keep Grace in a good school, keep this house, keep Vanessa from losing everything she worked for. And me, I asked softly. He stopped. I looked at him through tears I refused to let fall. Where did I fit into what you were trying to protect? Ethan's jaw flexed. You don't understand. No, I whispered. I think I finally do. Vanessa stepped forward. You had money sitting there while we were suffering. The cruelty of that sentence took my breath away. Money sitting there. My life became money sitting there. Walter's overtime shifts. My aching feet after 12-hour nursing shifts. The years we skipped vacations. The insurance check I could barely look at after burying my husband. To Vanessa, all of it was just sitting there, unused, waiting. I looked at her calmly. That money was not your rescue plan. Her face twisted. You lived under our roof. I nearly laughed again, but this time it would have sounded broken. Under your roof, I repeated quietly. The roof my husband's death helped pay for Vanessa froze. Ethan's head turned sharply toward me. What are you talking about? Richard finally spoke. Aria retained protected financial interests tied to the original down payment structure. Silence. Vanessa looked genuinely stunned. You're lying. Richard's expression didn't change. I have the documents. Ethan stared at him, then at me. For the first time, he looked less angry and more afraid. Because now the story they'd told themselves was collapsing. I wasn't some helpless dependent tucked away in their basement. I was part of the foundation they had been standing on. You knew where that money came from? I said to Ethan. He looked away. That was different. How he didn't answer. I continued softer now. That money came from Walter dying, from me signing papers with funeral flowers still wilting in the living room. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't force you. No, I said. You just knew I would give it because I loved you. That landed. I saw it. For a moment, his eyes filled with something close to shame. Then Vanessa destroyed it. So what were we supposed to do? She demanded. Let everything fall apart while she plays martyr. Grace gasped softly. I turned toward Vanessa. Is that what you think I am? Vanessa's face burned red now. I think you enjoy being pitied. Ethan whispered Vanessa stop, but she didn't. Not anymore. The mask had fallen completely. You come into our home with your sad stories and your dead husband and your little fragile act. Vanessa snapped. Do you know how exhausting it is? Grace started crying. Mom stopped. Vanessa pointed toward me. No, she needs to hear it. We put our lives on hold for her. I stared at my daughter-in-law and finally saw the truth plainly. She had never loved me. Not once. She had tolerated me when I was useful and resented me when I became inconvenient. But Ethan was the wound that mattered, because he had allowed it. I looked past Vanessa directly at him. You let her speak to me like this. His face crumpled slightly, but he still didn't defend me. Not truly. Then Richard's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it briefly, frowned, and looked toward Ethan. Mr. Moore, he said carefully, is your business partner named Caleb Turner? Ethan went still. Vanessa's head snapped toward Richard. Why Richard didn't answer her. He looked at Ethan. Because he just sent me documentation regarding outstanding debts tied to more custom renovations. Ethan's face drained of color. I stared at my son. What documentation? Richard's voice stayed professional. Messages suggesting Ethan planned to secure funds through his mother's estate or property interest. The silence afterward was so complete, I could hear the candles crackling. Grace whispered, Dad. Ethan looked suddenly sick. I was venting. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. One message says, once Mom signs, we can liquidate enough to cover the commercial loan before they sue. Liquidate. The same word from the paperwork. My heart didn't break this time. It hardened. Not with hatred. With final understanding. This was never about care. Never about planning. Never about family. It was a rescue operation for Ethan's failures built on my obedience. I stood slowly. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. You were going to sell pieces of my life to pay for your mistakes. Ethan stepped toward me. Mom, I was desperate. That is not an apology. His eyes flashed. What do you want me to say? The truth. I just told you the truth. No, I said. You told me your excuses. That broke him? His face twisted with anger and humiliation. Fine, he snapped. Yes, I needed the money. Yes, I thought it would be easier if everything was already in place. Are you happy now? Grace covered her mouth, sobbing. Vanessa looked away. Richard closed his folder quietly. And I stood there looking at the child I once rocked through fevers, the boy whose college textbooks I bought with grocery money, the man who now saw my signature as his escape route. No, I whispered. I am not happy. My voice cracked, but I kept going. I am grieving. Ethan's anger faded slightly. I stepped closer just enough for him to hear every word. I am grieving the son I raised, because whoever you are tonight, he is not the boy your father and I loved into adulthood. Tears filled Ethan's eyes, but still he said nothing. No apology, no responsibility, only silence. That was when I knew the will had not destroyed our family. The greed had. The paperwork simply revealed what was already dead. Nobody spoke for a very long time after that. The house felt hollow, like the walls themselves had finally heard too much truth to keep standing the same way. Vanessa disappeared upstairs first without another word. Her heels struck the staircase sharply, each step filled with anger and humiliation. Grace sat quietly at the table, crying into her hands. Richard remained near the doorway, respectful enough not to interrupt the grief unfolding in front of him. And Ethan just stood there, not yelling anymore, not defending himself, just standing in the wreckage of the night like a man suddenly realizing he no longer recognized his own reflection. I looked at him carefully. He looked older somehow, not physically, spiritually, the kind of aging that happens when illusions finally collapse. Then I reached for Walter's letter again. My fingers trembled against the paper. "This wasn't the only thing your father left behind," I whispered. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly toward me. Pain flashed across his face the moment Walter entered the conversation again. Because no matter how selfish Ethan had become, Walter's opinion still lived somewhere deep inside him. Richard quietly pulled another folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "I think it's time," he said softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "What is that?" Richard looked toward me first. I nodded. Then he opened the folder carefully. Several years before his death, Walter established a protected trust solely under Aria's authority. Ethan blinked. Richard slid the paperwork across the table. "Your father anticipated the possibility that financial pressure inside the family might someday compromise Aria's independence." The silence that followed felt endless. Grace slowly lifted her head. I watched Ethan read the documents. His hands shook slightly. Not from anger this time. Shock. Real shock. "He thought I'd steal from Mom," he whispered. Richard answered carefully. "No. He believed Aria's kindness made her vulnerable." That hit harder. I saw it immediately in Ethan's face, because Walter had not viewed him as evil, just weak enough to justify selfishness when desperate, and maybe that truth hurt even more. I folded Walter's letter slowly before speaking. "Your father knew me better than anyone." Ethan stared down at the trust paperwork. "When did he do this?" "About 6 months after his diagnosis." His face tightened. "That long ago?" I nodded. "He worried about what would happen after he died." Grace whispered softly. "Grandpa saw this coming." Tears burned my eyes instantly. "No," I said quietly. "I think he prayed he was wrong." That broke something in Ethan. I saw it happen. His shoulders sagged slightly, his jaw unclenched. And suddenly, he didn't look angry anymore. He looked ashamed. Richard reached into the folder again. "There's one more item." He carefully removed a small velvet box and placed it on the table in front of Ethan. I recognized it immediately. Walter's watch. The silver firefighter watch he wore every day for nearly 25 years. The watch Ethan used to beg to wear as a child, while pretending to be like his father. Ethan stared at the box silently. "He left that for me," he whispered. "Yes." Slowly, Ethan opened it. The watch rested inside, beside a folded note written in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan looked suddenly terrified to touch it, like he already knew the words inside might destroy him. "Read it," I whispered softly. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note. The room stayed silent while his eyes moved across the page. Then his breathing changed. Sharp. Uneven. I knew that reaction. Walter's words had reached him. Finally, Ethan whispered the letter aloud. "Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and life has probably become harder than either of us wanted. Listen carefully. A man's character is revealed most clearly by how he treats people who can no longer give him anything, especially his mother." Ethan stopped reading. His face crumpled. Grace quietly began crying again. I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. Walter's voice filled the room so vividly through those words that for a moment I could almost feel him standing beside me. Ethan continued reading shakily. "Your mother will love you long after you deserve it. Do not mistake that love for permission to become selfish. Protect her dignity even when life becomes difficult, especially then. Because one day, your children will learn what love looks like by watching how you treat her." The silence afterward shattered me completely. Grace lowered her face into her hands. And Ethan, my son, finally broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. He simply sat down in the chair like his legs no longer worked. Then tears started falling. Real tears. Not frustration, not manipulation. Grief. "I didn't mean for it to become this," he whispered brokenly. I closed my eyes briefly. How many tragedies begin with exactly that sentence? Vanessa reappeared quietly near the staircase, then arms crossed tightly around herself. Even she looked shaken now. Ethan stared at Walter's watch in his trembling hands. "I was scared," he whispered. No one answered. "Because fear explains behavior, but it does not erase it." He looked toward me slowly. "When the business started collapsing, I kept thinking if I could just hold everything together long enough, maybe nobody would get hurt." I looked at him quietly. "But you chose me as the sacrifice." His face twisted painfully. I didn't see it that way. "No," I whispered. "You saw me as stable, dependable, someone who would keep forgiving you no matter what." That was the truth, and from the way Ethan lowered his head, he knew it too. Grace stood suddenly and walked toward her father. For one hopeful second, I thought maybe she was going to hug him. Instead, she stopped several feet away. "You made Grandma feel unwanted," she whispered through tears. Ethan looked shattered. "I know." "No," Grace said quietly. "I don't think you did know." That landed harder than any yelling could have. Because children often tell the truth with devastating simplicity. Vanessa finally spoke again, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "We were under pressure." Grace turned toward her mother slowly. "You still don't get it." Vanessa froze. Grace wiped her face. "Grandma would have helped you if you treated her with love." Silence. God, that child understood more than all of us adults combined. Because she was right. If Ethan had come to me honestly, if he'd sat beside me and said, "Mom, I'm scared. I'm drowning. I need help," I would have emptied every account I had to save him. That was the tragedy of it all. They destroyed trust, trying to manipulate what love would have given freely. I looked around the dining room slowly. The candles had nearly burned out. Half-eaten food sat cold on plates. The fake birthday decorations suddenly looked pathetic. And right there in the middle of all that silence and regret, I finally understood something clearly Money hadn't ruined my family. Entitlement had. Walter knew it years ago. I just loved my son too much to see it. I moved out 3 days later. Not after another screaming match. Not after police. Not after some dramatic family explosion. Just quietly. Honestly, that somehow made it sadder. The morning I left, Cleveland skies were pale gray and heavy with the promise of snow. I woke before sunrise and sat alone in the basement room one final time. The room looked smaller now. Or maybe I had finally stopped shrinking myself to fit inside it. Most of my belongings fit into 4 boxes. That realization hurt more than I expected. 68 years of life reduced to photographs, clothes books, and Walter's cedar box. No one should grow old feeling temporary in someone else's home. Upstairs, I could hear muffled movement in the kitchen. Vanessa. Cabinet doors opening, coffee brewing, ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning, except nothing about our family felt ordinary anymore. Grace came downstairs first. The moment she saw the packed boxes, tears filled her eyes again. "You're really leaving?" I smiled softly. "I think it's time." She wrapped her arms around me so tightly I nearly lost my breath. For a moment, I simply held my granddaughter and let myself feel the grief fully. Because despite everything, I was still losing my family. Grace pulled back slowly. "I hate this. I know. It shouldn't have happened." "No," I whispered, but pretending things were okay wouldn't have fixed it either. She looked down at the boxes quietly. "Where are you going?" I hesitated for a second before answering. "There's a condo near Lake Erie." Grace blinked. "You bought a condo?" A small smile touched my face for the first time in weeks. Your grandfather prepared better than any of us realized. Walter. Even after death, that man was still protecting me. The condo wasn't large, just a quiet 2-bedroom unit in a lakeside building about 40 minutes away. Nothing luxurious, but it was mine. Mine. I cannot explain how powerful that word feels after spending years feeling unwanted. Grace helped carry boxes upstairs. The moment we entered the kitchen, silence fell instantly. Vanessa stood near the counter, holding a coffee mug. Ethan sat at the table, staring down at Walter's watch on his wrist. Seeing it there nearly broke me, because despite everything, some part of him still wanted connection to his father. Vanessa spoke first. "You're really doing this? Not are you okay? Not can we talk? Just accusation disguised as disbelief?" I nodded calmly. "Yes." Vanessa shook her head sharply. "This is unbelievable." Ethan finally looked up. "Vanessa." Something in his tone stopped her. For the first time in years, I heard exhaustion instead of entitlement in my son's voice. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, like he hadn't slept since the dinner party. Good. Maybe shame should keep people awake sometimes. Grace carried another box toward the front door quietly, while Ethan stood slowly. "Mom?" The words sounded fragile now. I waited. He swallowed hard. I never wanted things to go this far. There it was again. The sentence people say after they've already crossed every boundary. I looked at him sadly. "You still don't understand." His face tightened. "What this didn't go too far when I changed the will." I stepped closer carefully. "It went too far when you stopped seeing my dignity as important." Silence. Vanessa looked away immediately. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck shakily. "I know I messed up." Messed up. Such small language for enormous wounds. Still, it was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from him yet. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I whispered. "You did." He looked like he wanted me to comfort him. That realization startled me. Even now, some part of Ethan still expected his mother to help him carry the emotional consequences of hurting her. But I couldn't do that anymore. Not if I wanted to survive what was left of my own life. The moving company arrived around 9. 2 men loaded my boxes while neighbors pretended not to stare. Grace followed me outside, holding Walter's cedar box carefully in both hands. "This one stays with you," she whispered. I touched her cheek gently. "Always." Then Ethan came outside. Vanessa stayed inside the house. I noticed that immediately. She didn't come say goodbye. Maybe pride stopped her, maybe guilt, maybe nothing at all. Cold wind moved through the driveway while Ethan shoved his hands into his coat pockets. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked the question I think he'd been carrying all week. "Did you really change everything? Not can we fix this? Not are you hurt? Still the will? Still the money?" My heart cracked all over again, because even after shame and exposure and tears, part of him remained trapped inside fear over what he lost financially. I looked at him carefully. "You still care more about the inheritance than why I changed it." His eyes widened slightly. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Ethan looked away toward the street. The silence stretched painfully. Finally, he whispered something so soft I almost missed it. "I don't know how to fix any of this. That was the first honest thing he'd said in months. Not manipulation, not excuses, just truth. I felt tears rise unexpectedly, because suddenly I saw him clearly again. Not as the little boy he once was, not as the selfish man he became, but as a frightened human being who made terrible choices while drowning in fear and pride. And somehow, that hurt even worse. "You start," I whispered carefully, "by learning the difference between needing help and feeling entitled to sacrifice other people for it." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And for the first time in years, I think he finally saw his mother again instead of a solution. Grace hugged me one last time before I climbed into my car. "I'll visit every weekend," she promised immediately. I laughed softly through tears. "You'd better." The drive to Lake Erie felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't grieving. I was, deeply. But grief and freedom can exist together. That's something nobody tells you. When I arrived at the condo building, the lake stretched endlessly beneath gray skies. Waves crashed softly against the shore, while gulls drifted through cold wind overhead. The condo itself smelled like fresh paint and quiet beginnings. Large windows faced the water. There was a tiny balcony with enough room for flowers in spring. And best of all, no one looked irritated that I existed there. That first evening, I sat alone, wrapped in a blanket, watching the lake darken beneath sunset. No tension, no whispers upstairs, no careful monitoring of my movements. Just silence. Peaceful silence. Then my phone rang. Ethan. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello," heavy breathing filled the line. "Then, Mom." I waited, and once again, my son broke my heart with the very next sentence. "Did Richard already finalize all the paperwork?" I closed my eyes slowly. Not because I was angry anymore, because I finally understood something tragic. Some people do not change the moment they regret hurting you. They change only after they truly lose access to what they wanted from you. And I still didn't know which kind of man my son would become. Winter arrived quietly along Lake Erie. Snow gathered against the edges of my balcony, while gray waves rolled endlessly beneath frozen skies. Some mornings, I'd sit beside the window with coffee warming my hands and wonder how one family dinner managed to split my life into two separate versions of myself. The woman before the leftovers, and the woman after. The strange thing, I liked the second woman more. Not because she was harder, because she was finally honest. Months passed slowly after I moved into the condo. At first, the silence frightened me. I had spent so long living inside tension that peace itself felt unfamiliar. But eventually, little pieces of me returned. I started sleeping through the night again. I planted flowers on the balcony even though winter kept trying to kill them. I joined a volunteer group that visited elderly residents in assisted living facilities nearby. That experience changed me deeply. Do you know how many older people spend entire afternoons staring at doors that never open? How many mothers sit alone waiting for children who only call when paperwork is involved? One woman named Helen cried simply because I remembered her favorite tea order. That broke me. Because loneliness becomes unbearable when the world starts treating aging like inconvenience instead of humanity. Grace visited almost every weekend. Those visits became the brightest parts of my life. She'd bring homework, cheap bakery cookies, and endless stories about school drama. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we sat quietly watching the lake while snow drifted outside the windows. And slowly, the condo stopped feeling temporary. It became home. One afternoon in early spring, Grace burst through the front door holding an envelope and crying. I got it. I stood up so quickly my knees protested. What happened? She laughed through tears and threw her arms around me. The scholarship. My chest tightened instantly. Grace had been accepted into Northwestern University. Not only accepted, supported. The educational trust Walter and I created through the revised estate plan would cover her tuition, housing, books, everything. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just held my granddaughter while she cried happy tears against my shoulder. You did this for me? She whispered. No, I said softly. Your grandfather and I believed in you. That night, we celebrated with takeout Chinese food on the balcony while cold wind rolled off the lake. Grace looked happier than I'd seen her in years. Lighter, free. And for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt certain I had made the right decision. Not because Ethan lost something, because Grace gained a future untouched by manipulation. Around that same time, Ethan started calling more often. At first, the conversations were awkward and painfully short. How are you? How's the condo? Need anything? Careful questions. Cautious questions. Questions asked by someone still unsure whether he deserved answers. I noticed something else, too. He stopped mentioning the will, entirely. That mattered more than he probably realized. One evening, nearly 6 months after I moved out, a letter arrived in my mailbox with Ethan's handwriting across the front. I stared at it for nearly an hour before opening it. Because part of me was still afraid, not of anger anymore, of disappointment. I finally unfolded the pages slowly beside the window overlooking the lake. Mom, I've rewritten this letter at least 20 times. There's no version that makes me look good, so I'll stop trying. I was selfish. I kept telling myself I was protecting my family, but the truth is, I became so consumed by fear and money that I stopped seeing what I was doing to you. When I think about that dinner now, the leftovers, I honestly feel sick. You didn't deserve any of it. Not the basement, not the pressure, not the humiliation. Not from me. Tears blurred the words immediately. I sat down slowly. Outside, waves crashed softly against the shoreline. I kept reading. Dad would be ashamed of me. The hardest part is realizing Grace already was. I don't expect forgiveness right now. Maybe I haven't earned it yet, but I'm trying to understand why I became someone willing to hurt the person who loved me most. I miss you, not your money. You. That sentence destroyed me. because for months I had wondered whether Ethan even knew the difference anymore. I folded the letter carefully against my chest and cried harder than I had in weeks. Not because everything was magically healed. It wasn't. Some wounds don't disappear simply because apologies arrive. But grief changes shape when truth finally enters the room. A few days later, Ethan visited the condo for the first time. He looked different. Thinner, quieter. Walter's watch still rested around his wrist. We sat across from each other near the window while silence filled the room gently instead of violently. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I sold the house." I blinked. "What?" He nodded once. The debt was too much. There was no self-pity in his voice this time, only honesty. And Vanessa. He looked down briefly. We separated. I felt sadness immediately, not satisfaction, just sadness. Because broken families leave damage everywhere, even when accountability matters. Ethan rubbed his hands together nervously. "I'm in therapy now." That surprised me. I didn't know how angry I'd become, he admitted quietly, or how entitled. I studied my son carefully. And for the first time in a long while, I saw traces of the boy Walter and I once raised. Not fully restored, but trying. Trying mattered. Before leaving, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed me something folded carefully. Another letter. "What's this?" He swallowed hard. I wrote down every memory I could remember about Dad. My chest tightened instantly. I didn't want those stories to disappear. God, that nearly shattered me. Because once upon a time, Ethan used to love hearing stories about Walter. Somewhere along the way, fear and pride buried that part of him beneath survival and greed. But maybe it wasn't completely gone. After he left, I sat alone watching sunset spill gold across Lake Erie. Walter's cedar box rested beside my chair. Grace's college acceptance letter sat on the table, and Ethan's apology remained folded carefully in my hands. I thought about inheritance then. Not money, not houses, not legal documents, real inheritance. The things parents unknowingly pass down every day. Love, shame, kindness, entitlement, dignity. In the end, I realized changing my will had never really been about punishment. It was about protecting the last piece of myself nobody had the right to take. My dignity. And strangely enough, once I protected that, healing finally became possible. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people we spent our entire lives loving without conditions. As parents, we often believe sacrifice alone will guarantee gratitude. But love without boundaries can slowly teach others to take us for granted. Growing older should never mean becoming invisible. Respect is not something elderly parents must earn through usefulness money or silence. Every human being deserves dignity, especially from the family they helped build. And for anyone listening tonight who feels guilty for finally choosing themselves, please remember this: protecting your peace is not cruelty. Setting boundaries is not betrayal. And loving someone does not mean allowing them to destroy your self-worth. Sometimes the strongest act of love is refusing to reward disrespect anymore. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced disrespect from someone you sacrificed everything for? And if you were in Aria's position, would you have changed the will too? Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories about family healing and emotional strength mean something to you. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel.